Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with the story of people who reached enlightenment through their rectum. That's not a metaphor. This is a world where sacred visions came after a tobacco enema, where children were initiated with psychoactive vomit, and where diplomacy occasionally involved toad venom and synchronized hallucinations under temple firelight. From gods who spoke through nausea, to priests with monkey-shaped syringes, to prophecies delivered mid-seizure while covered in ash. This isn't the kind of spirituality you learned in Sunday school. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy strange truths, sacred fluids, and mildly cursed anthropology at bedtime. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. I love imagining where these ancient stories are quietly slipping into your modern world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe wrap yourself in something soft. Let the night settle over you like ritual smoke. And let's enter, slowly, reverently, and possibly sideways, the psychedelic temples of pre-Columbian Central America. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. If you were born in pre-Columbian Central America, your spiritual journey wouldn't have started with yoga or green juice. No, you'd be naked, kneeling on sacred stone, and preparing to take a boiling hot enema full of fermented tobacco straight up your divine little back door. Because apparently, enlightenment enters from the rear. This wasn't fringe, this was protocol. The Maya, the Zapotec, the Toltec, they didn't dabble. They engineered religious experiences with surgical precision and ceramic syringes the size of ocarinas. And they had one belief in common: the shortest path to the gods was through your colon. So imagine this: you wake up before dawn, already fasting, already chanting, already regretting your choices. A priest hands you a sacred gourd full of hallucination juice and tells you not to drink it. No, that would be inefficient. That would involve digestion, nausea, vomiting, rookie moves. Instead, you're ushered toward a beautifully carved clay device shaped like a howler monkey and told to assume the position, and no one even blinks. Because this, my friend, is science. It's not just any liquid. It's a sacred concoction brewed with Nicotiana rustica, a strain of tobacco so strong it would make your Marlboro uncle see Jesus. Often mixed with alcohol, tree resins, crushed toads, and the tears of everyone who's done this before. It's not meant to feel good. It's meant to work. You're not here to relax. You're here to get obliterated and reborn in front of your entire community. This is not a solo trip in your bedroom with ambient music and a trip sitter. This is state-sanctioned, priest-administered cosmic plumbing. The temples are echoing with drums. The air is thick with incense and sweat. And you, poor, unclothed you, are about to become a channel for divine consciousness, whether you like it or not. The priest doesn't ask for consent. He locks eyes, lifts the monkey's syringe, and sends the sacred cocktail into orbit via your rectum. And that's when the fun starts. Your body goes stiff. Your vision shatters. There's a moment where you wonder if the gods are entering your spine or simply trying to escape it. You start convulsing, chanting words you didn't know you knew, possibly inventing a new dialect of terror. You are definitely communicating with something. Maybe your ancestors, maybe a giant serpent made of stars. You'll write about it later. If you survive, you don't walk away from this ritual. You're dragged, gently, by attendants who've done this before and know exactly when to mop the drool off your chin. You collapse beside the altar, trembling, not quite in your body, not quite out of it. People applaud. Someone smears sacred ash on your forehead. You're officially a vessel. But don't get cocky. That wasn't possession. That was just preheating. Because now that you've cleared the passageway, it's time for the real guests to arrive. There are parts of the body that modern people consider private, discreet, to be hidden, deodorized, and definitely not spiritualized. But if you'd been born into the ancient Maya elite, your sacred geometry didn't start with chakras or third eyes. It started with the rectum, because that's not your butt back there. That's a portal, a divine gateway, a fast lane to the gods, lined with mucous membranes and zero patience for colonial shame. You don't laugh at it, you bow to it, you respect it, and occasionally, you point a monkey-shaped enema at it and pray. You see, the people of Mesoamerica didn't just trip for fun. Their world was built on cycles, birth and death, light and darkness, in-breath and out. Squirt. The idea was simple. The body is a vessel. And sometimes, the fastest way to fill that vessel with sacred power is to flush it clean. From the bottom up. And they were precise. They didn't chug anything. That was for peasants and frat boys. They used ceramic syringes, not primitive, not makeshift. We're talking engineered with care, elegance, and a truly disturbing understanding of fluid dynamics. Some were shaped like animals. Others bore the faces of gods. One particularly detailed enema pipe from the Mixtec region includes feathered serpent iconography, because if you're going to hallucinate a god entering your colon, it might as well be Quetzalcoatl. Why the rectum, you ask? Because it's fast, direct. No nausea, no vomiting, no interference from the stomach. Just straight absorption into the bloodstream and straight ejection into the spirit realm. This was pharmacology before pharmacies, physiology without textbooks, and yes, a cultural middle finger to our tidy little notions of what counts as civilized. It wasn't just the method, it was the experience. People didn't just get high, they got seized, flung from their bodies. They foamed at the mouth, rolled their eyes back, spoke in riddles, danced in rhythms they didn't learn, and made contact with something bigger, darker, and older than anything they could name. And here's the kicker. This wasn't weird. This was Thursday. Elite rituals, political ceremonies, funerals, healing rites, all of it infused with altered states, achieved rectally. In many cases, the enema wasn't just a step in the ritual. It was the ritual. The act of administering it, receiving it, and surviving it marked you as transformed. You'd been entered, not by a spirit, metaphorically, no, by one physically, chemically, spiritually crashing into your bloodstream at the speed of bowel panic. But this wasn't just biology, this was language, a sacred lexicon of plant, pipe, and purging. The experience had meaning, a lexicon of inner winds, spirit rivers, and ancestral voices made audible through sweat and song. The body wasn't just a stage, it was a transmission tower, and the message well, that depended on the plant. Because next came the real kick, the substance itself. Because you see, the sacred enema wasn't just a method, it was a message. And that message came from tobacco. But not the mild mentholated kind your aunt smokes in secret behind the shed. No, this was Nicotiana rustica, the botanical equivalent of being smacked in the soul with a burning obsidian tablet. Let's be very clear. This tobacco was not for pleasure. It wasn't rolled into neat sticks and passed around at parties. It was brewed, concentrated, and weaponized. It contained up to 9 times the nicotine content of modern strains, which, when introduced through the rectum, bypassed your liver and went straight to your bloodstream like a divine punch to the pineal gland. In ancient Mesoamerica, tobacco wasn't a vice. It was a god. It cured illness, banished demons, opened portals, and in large enough doses, turned your brain into a blinking radio tower for the dead. It was burned as incense, smoked in pipes, rubbed on wounds, and of course, lovingly administered through sacred re-entry ritual. Why? Because this wasn't recreational. This was communicative. The high wasn't a bonus, it was the whole point. The visions that followed weren't considered side effects. They were sacred transmissions. If you started convulsing and muttering in tongues, that wasn't an overdose. That was a sign it was working. And tobacco didn't act alone. Oh no, it brought friends. Sometimes it was combined with alcohol, fermented honey, datura, or even powdered toads, because if you're already sprinting toward the spirit realm with your dignity around your ankles, why not bring venom? These were dangerous cocktails, intentionally so. A high-ranking shaman was expected to toe the line between ecstasy and organ failure. Too little, and the gods won't hear you. Too much, and you're speaking to them permanently. Balance was everything, and you had to learn it by experience, trial and error, mostly error, and the hallucinations. Not gentle. You didn't see soft colors and friendly trees. You saw cosmic serpents, blood-drenched ancestors, screaming skeletons with mirrors for eyes. And if you were lucky, they gave you advice. If not, well, at least you provided entertainment for the temple crowd. Because yes, people watched. These were public rituals. You'd be foaming at the mouth on a limestone slab, while the community nodded approvingly and murmured things like, "Ah, yes, the gods are pleased," as you violently communed with your astral digestive tract. And here's the most disturbing part. You were expected to come back with information. The crop cycle, the next sacrifice, who stole the maize. You didn't just trip, you reported. And if your answer was vague, someone might suggest a second dose, larger, with frogs. But all of this, the syringes, the dosages, The absolute disregard for your intestinal peace only worked because everyone agreed on one thing: you weren't hallucinating, you were receiving, and what you received had to be decoded. Because now that you're full of visions and sweat and possibly insect spirits, it's time to figure out what it all means. You've just communed with the gods through the business end of a monkey-shaped syringe, and your body still hasn't decided if it's blessed or betrayed. But you're not done. No, now comes the unpacking. Because in pre-Columbian Central America, a vision wasn't private property, it was sacred data. And every sacred experience required sacred tools. So let's take a look at your gear. First, the syringe itself, the ceramic enema applicator. You might think of it as crude, maybe medical. You'd be wrong. These things were beautiful, handcrafted, often glazed, sometimes painted with animal motifs or geometric patterns meant to represent celestial cycles. Some looked like jaguars, others like God's mid-scream. One mixtec example has delicate feather engravings along the shaft, because even if you're getting spiritually blasted into the void, there's no excuse for bad design. These weren't hidden away, they were stored in temples, offered to the gods, displayed in ritual spaces like relics of transformation, which, to be fair, they were. Then there were the snuff tubes, narrow clay devices used for blowing powdered hallucinogens directly into the nose, because why limit the chaos to one orifice? These were especially popular among priests, dancers, and those who needed immediate results without waiting for digestion or dignity to kick in. Some pipes doubled as whistles, designed to make you hallucinate and provide the soundtrack. Others had dual chambers, allowing for complex blends of substances, because if you're going to flirt with spiritual death, you may as well go custom. Let's not forget the containers, gourds, bowls, and vessels used to mix and ferment the substances. Many of these were carved with glyphs that described the ingredients, dosage, or the god you were expected to encounter once the room began melting. Basically, ancient drug labels, FDA not included, and the most subtle tool, incense, specifically copula tree resin burned during these rituals to sedate the room, summon the spirits, and absolutely destroy your sinuses. If the vision didn't knock you out, the smoke would. But that was the point. The senses had to collapse. Vision, sound, smell, equilibrium, all stripped down and rewired so the gods had room to enter. And here's the thing. All of this, every whistle, bowl, syringe, and sniffing straw, was part of a designed experience. This was ritual architecture for the body. Every angle curated, every gesture coded. You didn't just ingest the gods. You navigated them, with tools older than conquest, and smarter than most people give them credit for. Because the point wasn't just to see something. It was to feel the divine rearranging your nervous system. And if the right tools weren't used, if the incense burned too hot, if the liquid wasn't mixed properly, if the vessel hadn't been blessed, the entire journey could go sideways. Or worse, silent. And silence, in this context, didn't mean peace. It meant the gods weren't listening, which is why the tools were guarded, revered, and often buried with their owners. You didn't leave a whistle lying around after it had summoned a deity with 8 arms and a habit of speaking in bird calls. You took it to the grave. But don't worry, you're not there yet. You're still twitching on the temple floor, wondering what just came through your spine and whether it had wings. Because now comes the most important part, interpreting what you saw and what saw you back. You're still shivering. The drums have stopped. The priest has wiped your face with something that smells like tree sap and ash. And your soul feels like it's been cracked open like a clay pot, which, according to everyone around you, is excellent news. Because now the real work begins, figuring out what the gods said, while you were busy convulsing on the limestone. You see, in pre-Columbian Central America, a hallucination wasn't just a trippy accident, it was a message. And your job, or rather, the priest's job through your flailing body, was to decode it. These weren't vague symbols or floating jellyfish. Visions had structure, meaning. There were established patterns, rivers, caves, jaguars, burning skulls, upside-down mountains, and each one came with interpretation guidelines, more rigorous than modern dream analysis. A cave, that might be a portal to the underworld. A snake, a god is speaking. A snake with feathers, a god is screaming. And yes, your hallucinations counted as valid data, sacred data. They were compared, discussed, cross-referenced with omens, eclipses, and the latest bloodletting reports. You weren't tripping, you were receiving transmission. Because to the Maya, the Mixtec, and others, the universe wasn't silent. It was constantly broadcasting. Plants, ancestors, spirits, celestial bodies, all pushing information into the human world through dreams, illness, signs, and yes, rectally administered tobacco. You weren't supposed to enjoy the experience. You were supposed to survive it with information. And that information, it could be anything. The correct day for a harvest, the location of a lost heirloom, whether someone in the village had been cursed by a vengeful iguana spirit, or which unfortunate soul needed to be sacrificed next week to keep the sun from collapsing. Real helpful stuff. Shamans trained for years to interpret this. They knew the difference between a prophetic river and a digestive hallucination. They understood which deities arrived with purple jaguar heads and which ones preferred abstract shapes that hummed. And don't get it twisted, this wasn't freeform. You didn't get to say, I saw a glowing fish, therefore I should be king. There were social checks in place. Your vision had to align with tradition, with glyphs, with community consensus. If you claimed divine revelation and it didn't match the star chart, the priest didn't bless you. He offered you a second dose and a long stare. And if you didn't see anything, silence was suspicious. It meant something was blocking the signal. Impurity, guilt, or worse, divine disinterest. That's when the rituals got harsher. Stronger brews, longer fasts, maybe some self-cutting, just to see if a little blood cleared the line, because the gods were always talking. If you weren't hearing them, the problem was you. So you sat there, eyes wide, mouth dry, heart pounding with whatever divine residue still echoed in your bloodstream, and you told them what you saw. And they listened, or pretended to, and then wrote it down in neat glyphs beside the temple fire, while you tried not to pass out into the ashes. But even if your message was divine, even if the ancestors whispered directly through your throat and a serpent god licked your third eye mid-ritual, you weren't clean yet, because before a person could speak truth, they had to be purged, fully. And in the world of sacred communication, vomiting was a form of honesty. Which brings us, gently, or not so gently, to the next chapter in your journey. By now, your body has been used like a ceremonial antenna. Your spirit's taken a high-speed joyride through the underworld, and your mouth tastes like someone lit a campfire in it and called it holy. You'd think you've earned a break, a sacred nap, maybe some soup. But no, now it's time to purge. Because here's the thing, in ancient Mesoamerican ritual, pain wasn't just inevitable. It was the point. If you weren't sweating, shaking, puking, and occasionally crying into a stone basin, the gods assumed you weren't really trying. Purification wasn't a metaphor. It was physical, loud, sometimes projectile. The sacred body had to be emptied of toxins, of weakness, of ego, of anything that might obstruct the divine signal. You were supposed to suffer, gently, dramatically, and always under supervision. So let's talk about vomiting. You didn't throw up, you purged. It was a sacred release, a symbolic unraveling of the self. People gathered around to watch. Priests nodded solemnly while you emptied the contents of your soul and your stomach onto the altar steps. And if you were really committed, diarrhea too, which, when you think about it, is a very literal form of letting go. The logic was airtight. The body must suffer to be softened. Pain makes you porous. And once you're porous, the spirit world can pour in. This was biology, theology, and plumbing, all in one explosive package. This is why the tobacco was mixed strong. Why the rituals involved fasting. Why you had to chant between dry heaves while someone shook a rattle beside your head and whispered the names of stars you couldn't pronounce. It wasn't just to induce visions. It was to clean you out, inside and out, spiritually and calonically. And the rituals were tailored to the occasion. If the goal was healing, say for someone possessed or sick, then the purge was part of the exorcism. The evil spirit, they believed, lived in the fluids. Make the body release them, and the demon would lose its grip. If the goal was vision, prophecy, communication, divine instruction, the purge was a test. If you couldn't survive the ritual, how could you survive the message? Bloodletting sometimes joined the fun. Tiny cuts, especially on ears or tongues, added to the sacred cleansing. The idea wasn't self-harm for punishment. It was offering, a trade, a drop of your life in exchange for knowledge, power, or peace. And you did this willingly, publicly, with pride, because the clean body, the wrung out, half-conscious, spiritually marinated body was considered sacred, closer to the gods. And afterward, when you lay on the temple floor, dripping, lightheaded, half in this world and half in whatever dimension the toad venom took you to, you weren't ashamed. You were pure. You were ready. Because now that the spirits had hollowed you out, it was time to step into the space built just for them, and let the ceremony reshape not only your body, but your entire perception of reality. Which means it's time to stop puking and start performing. At this point, you're spiritually cleaned out, emotionally tenderized, and chemically realigned. You're lying on stone that remembers every scream it's ever heard. And now, it's time for the main event. Because an ancient Mesoamerican ritual where you tripped mattered just as much as what you took. The setting wasn't background, it was the spell. You didn't just pop a psychoactive enema in your hut and hope for the best. No, you were delivered into theater. Temples weren't just stone piles for praying. They were designed to echo, to amplify, to rattle the soul out of its shell. They were built with astronomical precision, aligned to solstices and equinoxes, constructed so your moaning would bounce back at you from eternity. Caves were used to deep, dripping, womb-like holes in the earth where spirits were known to dwell. Step into one and you weren't going down, you were going back. Ritual spaces often included painted murals, vivid images of gods vomiting stars, serpents birthing from navels, men half transformed into jaguars. These weren't artistic flair, they were instructional diagrams for what you were about to become. And then there was the sound, drums, flutes, bone whistles, rhythms repeated until your heartbeat gave up and surrendered to the collective pulse. The tempo wasn't random, it was a vehicle, steady, ancient, designed to carry your body into trance while your mind unraveled like old twine. And the smell, copal always kapow, a thick piney resin that smelled like burnt time. You'd inhale it until your nose burned and your brain began sculpting shadows into ancestors. Combined with the tobacco purge and the incense cloud, it created an atmosphere where breath, thought, and hallucination became indistinguishable. Then came the movement, because this wasn't a sit-down sermon. This was kinetic theology. You might dance, or more accurately, you might be danced by something else. Convulsions were welcomed, shaking was sacred, spasms were interpreted. The way your arms flailed, meaningful. The way your knees buckled, prophetic. A priest might circle you, observing your trembling like a scholar at a dissertation defense. And you weren't alone. Others were tripping too. Sometimes silently, sometimes howling, sometimes laughing in that unsettling way that means a jaguar god just complemented their bone structure. This was a group possession, and you were all feeding off each other's frequencies, like tuning forks made of meat and terror. Onlookers stood around you, family, villagers, nobles, watching with awe, concern, or envy. They weren't judging. They were waiting for signs, a name muttered, a gesture made, a revelation gifted mid-seizure. Your experience wasn't yours, it was theirs too. You were hosting the gods, and everyone wanted to see what they said. And if the gods didn't arrive, if your body didn't shake, your mouth didn't prophesy, your eyes didn't roll into some metaphysical socket of understanding, then something was wrong. The space itself could be blamed. Maybe the altar was cold. Maybe the incense was stale. Maybe the star alignment was off. Or just maybe you weren't open enough. So they'd start again. Louder drums, stronger mixtures, closer fire. Because this space didn't tolerate half measures. You weren't here to dabble. You were here to rupture. And rupture you did. Because next came the real experience. The moment where you stopped being you and started being something else entirely. If you're imagining all this happening in isolation, a lone shaman in a quiet cave, having a polite chat with the gods, you're still thinking way too modern. Pre-Columbian Central America didn't do therapy in silence. They did it with crowds. These were group trips, synchronized, choreographed, fully communal collapses of ego and body, carried out with precision, pageantry, and plenty of supervision. You weren't just hallucinating. You were participating in something cosmically public. So picture it, you're not the only one writhing on the temple floor. To your left, an elder is giggling uncontrollably because a maze spirit just told him a dirty joke. To your right, a teenager is vomiting on his cousin's sandal while reciting names he's never learned. Behind you, someone is dancing like their joints were tied to a xylophone. And none of this is alarming. It's expected. Everyone is high, together. The priest, stone-faced, but definitely dosing the drummers, probably tripping on cacao, sweat, and bone vibrations. The nobles, casually twitching behind gold masks. Even the guy shaking the incense bowl might be whispering to an invisible parrot. Why? Because in this world, divine revelation wasn't private, it was communal property. You weren't just having visions for yourself, you were having them for the village, for the ancestors, for the crops. The community joined your trip like it was a group chat, except the messages were delivered through shaking limbs, glossed over eyes, and the occasional mid-air shout of the corn god is pregnant. And when the gods arrived, and they did arrive, they didn't speak to you alone. They spoke through you, through the others, through the entire vibrating mass of sweating, swaying bodies. Sometimes the spirits came into one person and jumped to another. A woman would begin to howl, and a moment later, a child across the courtyard would finish her sentence in a voice that clearly wasn't his. The crowd didn't panic. They adjusted. The spirits were circulating. That's just good ritual logistics. And the people not tripping. They were watching. Closely they played instruments, fanned the fire, interpreted the gestures, took notes, literal ones, carved in glyphs or painted on murals. They observed your flailing with the gravity of someone watching a weather report. Yes, the rain is coming, she just told us. While biting the altar, it wasn't performance, though it looked like one. It was sacred transmission, and it didn't end when the visions stopped. You were expected to report back. Where did you go? What did you see? What did the gods ask for this time? And if you didn't remember, someone else probably did. That's the magic of group mind. There's always a backup witness. Because these rituals weren't experiments, they were rituals for a reason. They repeated, they were timed, they were structured around calendars older than Rome and more precise than your smartwatch. Even chaos had choreography. And now that the group is deep in it, everyone's soaked in sweat, revelation, and questionable liquids, something starts to shift. Not just within you, but through you. Because someone else is knocking now, not metaphorically, not in visions. Someone's about to enter. By now, your limbs no longer feel like they belong to you. They twitch with unfamiliar rhythm. Your tongue itches with syllables you've never practiced. You open your mouth, not to speak, but to release. Because in these rituals, hallucination was just the warm-up act. Possession was the main event. And when it hit, it didn't whisper, it took over. This wasn't theatrical. It wasn't an exorcism horror flick with dramatic Latin chanting and head spinning. It was worse. It was personal. You weren't invaded by demons. You were inhabited by relatives, dead ones, divine ones, ones whose names are carved into the temple walls and whose bones fertilize the cornfields. You didn't fear them. You housed them. For a few trembling minutes, you became their voice, their hands, their interpreter, whether you liked it or not. And they didn't wait politely. Your breath would change, your posture, your tone, your scent. You'd start snarling, or singing, or giving orders with the calm intensity of someone who hasn't blinked in centuries. You might scream in a forgotten dialect and demand honey, or blood, or that someone finally dig up Uncle Ixnel and give him a proper burial. And people would listen, because it wasn't you anymore. Not really. You were gone, loosened from the body, on temporary sabbatical while an ancestor borrowed your flesh for official business. Sometimes it was just for a moment, a bark, a command, a warning. Other times, it lasted hours, a slow, ritual unfolding of the self. While the community watched and nodded like this was just a really intense version of Tuesday. And who got possessed? Not just the priests, not just the chosen. Anyone, everyone, children, elders, warriors, weavers. The gods and dead weren't picky. If you were open, if your body had been sufficiently purged, your mind cracked wide enough, they'd step in. And if you resisted, they'd come anyway, sometimes gently, sometimes not. There are accounts in murals and codices of people writhing in mud, eyes rolled back, hands mimicking animal claws, while priests encircled them, chanting, fanning, occasionally slapping their faces with sacred leaves to keep them from biting someone's nose off mid-prophecy. And when the possession passed, you didn't remember much, just a ringing in the ears, a metallic taste, a vague impression that your grandmother's spirit had come through your throat to criticize your neighbor's harvest. But the community remembered. They'd transcribe your words, pass your gestures, and follow your instructions, assuming they made sense. If they didn't, well, there was always next time, or a stronger dose. Possession wasn't madness. It wasn't feared. It was function. It was communication with the other side, downloaded through sweat, smoke, and a buttload of tobacco. But the possessed body wasn't only a phone line. It was a threshold, a place where one life became another. And that, of course, was the key to something even deeper. Because if the gods could enter, then so could transformation. Not symbolic transformation. Not, I feel changed. But the real kind, irreversible, ritualized, absolute. And while possession was the climax of many rituals, the gods didn't reserve their little joyrides for seasoned priests or weathered elders. Oh no, they also came for the kids. Because this sacred chaos, the trembling, the shaking, the vomiting, the collapsing under the weight of spirits older than language, this was also how you grew up. You weren't eased into adulthood in pre-Columbian Central America. You were dragged into it by the ankles through a cloud of tobacco smoke, kicked awake by a jaguar god, and handed your first hallucination like a birth certificate. Initiation wasn't symbolic, it was chemical. Let me be very clear, those group rituals, they included adolescents. Children who'd just lost their first baby tooth were often being prepped for their first real encounter with death, or at least something that looked and sounded an awful lot like it. Because to become a real human, a proper person, as the Maya would say, you had to die first, not literally, metaphorically, intentionally, ritually. You had to be emptied out like a pot, and the best tool for that, a sacred dose of plants so powerful they could make you forget which direction time flowed. Tobacco, psilocybin, datura, morning glory seeds, fermented brews of honey and bark, and things were still trying to chemically decode, sometimes smoked, sometimes swallowed, and often especially for ceremonial purity, delivered via the sacred syringe, because the gods, it seems, didn't care how old you were, only that the medicine reached your bloodstream fast enough to shake the child out of your bones. They'd start young, small doses, carefully prepared, administered with chants, incense, and a drumbeat that rattled your ribcage loose. You'd be watched, held, whispered to. But make no mistake, you were expected to crack, to see, to scream, to return, different, and if you didn't, if you sat there stone-faced, blinking like a very confused lizard, they'd try again, stronger, louder, longer, because you weren't being initiated for comfort. You were being prepared for a lifetime of communion with powers that didn't speak softly. Once you broke, and you would break, the whole village watched, not out of cruelty, but recognition. You were being remade, in pain, in vision, in sacred fear. And when you came back, shivering and covered in ceremonial ash, they didn't ask you what you saw. They called you something new, not child, not student, but someone who'd met the gods in the dark and returned with teeth. And after that, you got new clothes, special food, a different seat at ceremonies. You were trusted, you were respected, and occasionally, yes, you were feared. Because now, if the gods came looking for someone to borrow, they had you on speed dial. But these gods weren't generic. They weren't warm, smiling sky fathers. They had names, personalities, preferences, addictions, and next, you're going to meet them. So you've danced, puked, convulsed, and briefly channeled your great aunt in a snake voice. And now you're lying in sacred dirt, pupils dilated, ears ringing with ancestral static, and you're asking the only question that matters, which god just borrowed my spinal cord for a sermon? Because make no mistake, these experiences weren't random. Every hallucination had a sponsor. The spirit realm of pre-Columbian Central America wasn't some faceless soup of divine energy. It was packed with personalities, each with a very specific vibe, favorite substance, and highly questionable approach to consent. Take God, El, for example. Not a very inspiring name, but an absolute heavyweight in the sacred smoke department. He was the Maya god of tobacco, trade, underworld wealth, and possibly bad decisions. He wore a jaguar pelt, carried cigars like status symbols, and sometimes appeared as an old man grinning through blackened teeth. He didn't whisper wisdom, he blew it into your face. And if your ritual included tobacco, and let's face it did, you were basically sending him a scented invitation to climb into your bloodstream and rearrange your priorities. Then there's Ix's Tab, the goddess of the noose and psychedelic release. She was associated with suicide, erotic sacrifice, and oddly, the sacred vision quest. In some codices, she hangs from a celestial rope, serene, eyes wide open. She wasn't worshipped in the modern sense. She was acknowledged, respected, possibly feared. But if you started moaning about death and rebirth mid-trip, chances are she was nearby, making notes. Some deities didn't even need names. The spirit of the bulch tree, for instance, wasn't a god per se, but its fermented bark, when mixed with honey and consumed during rituals, was understood to be alive. Drunk bulch wasn't about getting buzzed. It was about being filled with the tree's essence, which might weep through your eyes or mutter riddles in your sleep. And then there were the animal deities, jaguars, snakes, toads, all considered avatars of transformation. Toads, in particular, carried a potent venom that could induce trances when smoked or absorbed. Was it fun? No, it was terrifying. But if you started croaking during your trip, the priests didn't bat an eye. They'd just say, "Ah yes, he's touched by the toad," and possibly ask you for next year's planting dates. These gods didn't need temples, they needed hosts. And every time you bent over for the sacred enema or inhaled the mushroom-scented breath of the underworld, you were opening the door, not metaphorically, but literally, to be entered, used, spoken through. This was the point. The gods didn't float above you. They didn't gaze lovingly from afar. They entered, took over, rearranged your body like a ceremonial puppet, and made you the stage for their message. And the side effects: shaking, vomiting, divine guilt, new tattoos made of ash, all considered signs of favor. To be chosen by a god during a ritual was both blessing and burden. It meant you had to live with their voice echoing in your skull long after the drumming stopped. But sometimes they didn't come to talk. Sometimes they came to command. And when the gods gave instructions, especially about war, politics, or sacrifice, someone had to act on them. Let's not be naive. If the gods are speaking, someone's going to weaponize that. Enter hallucinogenic diplomacy. Because nothing says national policy quite like tripping so hard, you start reorganizing the calendar. In Mesoamerican civilizations, prophecy wasn't a metaphor. It was literal divine instruction, and it didn't come from scrolls or Senate debates. It came from someone who hadn't eaten in 4 days, just took a tobacco enema, and was now shouting about serpents in the sky while crawling in slow circles around a maize offering. And here's the wild part: people listened. When a priest or chosen visionary started channeling the gods, everyone paid attention, especially rulers. If the god said plant corn, you planted it. If the god said build a temple, you built it. If the god said invade the city 3 valleys over and burn their chilly fields to ash, well, time to polish the obsidian blades. War, in this context, wasn't always about power or territory. Sometimes it was about cosmic order. The gods demanded blood, not out of cruelty, but because they fed on sacrifice. And if your ritual trip revealed divine hunger, say, a flaming skeleton whispering, "More hearts, please," then you were suddenly writing strategy scrolls and assigning jaguar warriors to scouting missions. Before a major battle, leaders consulted seers. Sometimes the seers were kings themselves, trained in sacred pharmacology, initiated through years of ritual tripping, and absolutely convinced that the outcome of a war depended on whether they blinked at the right moon phase while possessed by a god of wind. The visions weren't optional, they were confirmation. He didn't launch a campaign unless the hallucinated serpent said yes. He didn't crown a new ruler unless the sacred mushrooms stopped screaming. And if the gods were silent, you delayed, or panicked, or doubled the dosage and tried again. This meant every major decision, war, trade, sacrifice, succession, passed through a psychedelic filter, and it wasn't always rational. One ruler might order 300 captives sacrificed because a vision told him the sun was tired. Another might declare a new alliance because a bat god appeared during his sacred purge and whispered tax advice. And yet, somehow it worked. Empires rose, cities flourished. Ritual calendars predicted eclipses with terrifying accuracy, all while being guided, at least partly, by people who had just come back from sweating and howling into a pile of burning feathers. Even messengers of peace sometimes arrived with drugs, ceremonial drinking, shared smoking. These were diplomatic protocols. Let us trip together and let the gods decide wasn't just poetic, it was how treaties were made. But diplomacy and prophecy had limits. Sometimes the visions were wrong, sometimes the gods lied, or maybe, more likely, the humans interpreted badly, which when your military plan is based on a hallucinated corn deity, can happen. And when things went badly, when the war failed, or the sun didn't rise, it wasn't the gods who got blamed. It was the medium, the seer, the drugged-up vessel who misheard divine instruction. So what did they do? They looked for purity, stronger rituals, fewer distractions, better channels, which brings us to the darkest part of the psychedelic legacy. What happens when the gods are silenced by force? Imagine you've spent your life learning to speak with the stars. Your gods talk through wind, through dreams, through the smell of burning bark, and the sudden urge to sing in a language no one remembers teaching you. And then, one day, men arrive, shiny, shouting, waving metal like it's punctuation, and they tell you that everything you've ever known is evil. That's how it started. The Spanish didn't just bring horses and smallpox. They brought Christianity, and with it, an intense theological dislike for anyone whose religious experience involved snakes, nudity, and projectile vomiting under the full moon. To the conquistadors and friars, your sacred enema wasn't a portal. It was possession, the bad kind, the kind with devils, your toad-drenched prophecies, witchcraft, your mushroom-fueled conversations with the dead, demonic. They didn't try to understand the ritual, they destroyed it. Temples were burned, syringes smashed, clay pipes crushed under boots that hadn't even bothered to ask what copal was. The codices that described the rituals, tossed into fires, page by page, as if silence could rewrite the past. The hallucinogenic plants, uprooted, banned, demonized, and the people who still heard the gods, they were hunted. Shamans were accused of sorcery, tortured, executed, or converted, which usually meant forced baptism, followed by silence. Imagine surviving a divine vision, only to be told it was satanic diarrhea, that your god, the one who'd whispered through your bones since childhood, was now illegal. To the colonizers, the body was a dirty thing. They couldn't comprehend that the rectum could be sacred, that sweat could be holy, that transformation might require screaming into the dirt. They didn't see sacred science. They saw savagery. And so they did what colonizers always do. They erased, renamed, replaced. In place of the old rituals, they offered sacraments you couldn't feel, sermons you couldn't question, and a god who only spoke through priests who didn't dance. But of course, not everything was lost. Some rituals went underground, plants were hidden, mixtures preserved in memory. The language changed, the symbolism adapted, but the need to break open, to touch the sacred through the body, never left. Even today, fragments remain, in local traditions, in whispered stories, in the faint, unkillable memory of a god who once entered through smoke, blood, and an enema shaped like a jaguar. But archaeology, like guilt, tends to unearth things. And the past, stubborn, psychedelic, and smelling faintly of fermented tree bark, refuses to stay buried. The priests may have been burned, the temples may have been flattened, the rituals may have been banned, condemned, and overwritten by men in frocks with very strong opinions about modesty. But you know what doesn't burn quite so easily? Ceramic. And so, centuries after the last sacred enema was publicly administered beneath a star-calibrated pyramid, archaeologists started digging, and what did they find? They found the syringes. Long, narrow, sometimes bulbous, often unmistakable. Ceramic enema applicators, some plain, some stunningly ornate, many with residue still crusted around the nozzles. One from the Maya site of Palenque had glyphs indicating not just ownership, but ritual context. It wasn't just a tool, it was a religious artifact, a delivery system for transformation. And it wasn't just syringes. Excavations at sites like Yaxchilan, El Zapotel, and Monte Alban revealed murals, carvings, and figurines showing men and women mid-trip, eyes half-lidded, limbs limp, sometimes vomiting into ceremonial bowls while a god watches from above. Sometimes the gods are vomiting too, which is comforting. These weren't isolated oddities. This was systemic ritual practice, documented not just in art, but in chemical traces. Residue analysis from certain syringes and snuff tubes has revealed the presence of nicotine, bufotenine, and other alkaloids linked to known hallucinogenic plants. In other words, we're not speculating anymore. We have forensic evidence of ancient people getting violently, reverently high. Even burial sites have yielded clues. Skeletons with wear patterns suggesting ritual kneeling, nasal bone erosion from constant snuffing, dental remains with traces of plant resins not associated with food. Some were buried with their pipes and syringes, nestled beside them like spiritual tools they might need in the afterlife. And speaking of the afterlife, tomb murals often depict the dead continuing their psychedelic journeys beyond death, still purging, still training, still communing. This tells us something crucial. These weren't just rites of healing or prophecy, they were cosmological. Getting high wasn't a break from life, it was a preparation for death. And even the landscapes themselves, sacred caves, mountaintops, riverside shrines, are being re-examined. Caves once thought to be ceremonial storage, are now understood as vision quest chambers, stalactites blackened by ancient torches, ceilings carved with stars, places where people went not to hide, but to dissolve. Because in this worldview, memory wasn't oral or written, it was embodied, and when the body was silenced, the material culture kept talking. And now we, modern, confused, chronically overstimulated, we're the ones listening. We're the ones holding the shards, peering into old pipes like they're telegrams from a wilder, more honest world. But we're also the ones who forgot. So here you are, not in a temple, not in a cave, but listening thousands of years later to the echo of a ritual that modernity tried very, very hard to erase. And what's left? A few broken syringes, some murals, a handful of charred codices that smell like conquest. And, if you're paying attention, a slow, gnawing realization. They knew something. No, not about atoms or electricity or how to tweet. They knew something about how to break a person open, not to destroy them, but to show them the shape of their own soul. They understood that pain wasn't always punishment, that purging could be purification, that if you want to hear the gods clearly, you sometimes have to scream first. They knew that transformation didn't happen in polite increments. It came in floods, in sweat, in convulsions. In that moment where you lose your name and remember something older, something crawling, humming, feathered, divine. They saw the body not as a prison, but as a portal. The rectum wasn't taboo, it was sacred infrastructure. The mouth wasn't for sermons, it was for spirit. The skin, the blood, the bile, all had roles to play in cosmological drama. And drugs, they weren't escapes. They weren't weekend hobbies or chemical distractions. They were invitations, key tests, instruments of communion prepared with care, administered with reverence, endured with awe. The sacred wasn't abstract, it was bodily, and sometimes messy. And that was okay, because what mattered wasn't how graceful you looked while foaming at the mouth. What mattered was what came through. They didn't just get high, they didn't just trip. They practiced transcendence on purpose, with structure, with the full weight of tradition and the wild unblinking eye of the gods upon them. And we forgot. We told ourselves the sacred had to be clean, quiet, respectable. We replaced the screaming god with a soothing voice that fits in our pocket. We paved over the caves. We locked the temples. We called the visions delusions. We called the wisdom madness. We sterilized everything. And yet, the gods are patient. Their tools still lie buried in the dirt. Their stories still rattle in forgotten syllables. Their presence, that thick, dizzying, undeniable presence, still lingers in the corners of the world we pretend we understand. And maybe, just maybe, as we sit here dry-eyed, sober, safe, we begin to wonder what it felt like to be cracked open and told, through blood and breath and sacred smoke, you are not alone. You never were. It didn't start as a performance. It never does. The whirling began in silence, in a room that smelled faintly of wool and rosewater, beneath a low ceiling heavy with incense, smoke, and unspeakable longing. Not for applause, not for transcendence, either. Longing, in the Sufi tradition, isn't a means to an end, it is the end. And in 13th century Konya, that longing found a rhythm, and the rhythm found feet. The man who gave it form wasn't trying to start a movement. Jalal al-Din Rumi was mourning. His beloved companion, philosopher, mystic, alleged troublemaker, Shams of Tabriz, had disappeared. Again, or perhaps been murdered. Again. Rumi didn't write about grief the way scholars do. He spun it. There's a story, too poetic not to be true, that he began turning in a market square, arms flung open like an abandoned child, until the world disappeared and only God remained. You won't find the choreography in any scripture. It wasn't handed down from the sky. It was coaxed out of the earth, with weeping, with silence, with motion that was too wide for language. Still, the spinning had a grammar. You didn't just flap around like a drunken ghost. You turned counterclockwise, always, because that's the way the heart tilts slightly left, always toward absence. The left foot rooted you, the right lifted, and each turn was both death and rebirth. They say the dervish rotates around an empty center, like planets around the sun, like moths around fire. There's a dark humor in that, chasing an absence as if it were a destination. But that's mysticism for you. You spend your life circling something that isn't there until you stop needing it to be. The Mevlevi order, the whirling dervishes, emerged from this spiral of grief and ecstasy, founded by Rumi's son, not as a cult of spin, but as a way to structure that unspeakable hunger into something replicable. You could train the body to remember what the soul had forgotten. The spin became a ritual. The ritual became a path. The path became a discipline. And, as always, the discipline outlived the desperation that birthed it. You might expect, after all this, that the point of the whirl was to reach some pristine peak of enlightenment. But no, the aim was annihilation. Not the cinematic kind with fire and flutes, the slow, unsettling erasure of the ego, one turn at a time, which brings us, quite naturally, to the question of how a body prepares for its own disappearance. Before you can vanish, you have to become visible, almost absurdly so. That's why the dervish dresses like death. The tall brown felt hat is a tombstone, the white robe a shroud, the black cloak they removed before spinning. That's the grave itself, shrugged off like a coat. And no, this isn't poetic embellishment. This is exactly how the garments are interpreted in Mevlevi tradition. You don't just dress for the divine, you dress for your own symbolic funeral. The ceremony, called the sema, isn't casual. It's a choreography of disappearance. Each detail is weighted with cosmology. Even the way the dervish enters the room, slowly, deliberately, head tilted, evokes the moment of emergence from non-being. You don't walk into the ritual, you descend. Then comes the alignment. The dervishes form a circle, always facing the sheikh, who represents the sun. Each dervish is a planet in orbit, spinning on their own axis while circling the divine center. It's sacred astronomy performed with bone and breath. The circle isn't just symbolic, it's spatial theology. You are literally practicing your place in the cosmos. And to avoid falling over like a misaligned galaxy, the dervish trains, not just balance exercises, though that's part of it. There are months, sometimes years, of walking in circles, mastering slow, deliberate rotations, learning not just to turn but to turn without turning inward. Because if you think about it too much, if you try to control the motion, you stumble. That's the paradox. You must be fully in your body, and at the same time, not yours anymore. There's also the hand gesture. It looks theatrical now, one palm facing up toward the heavens, the other turned downward toward the earth. But it's not a performance, it's a metaphysical circuit. You receive from the divine above and release into the world below. You are not the source. You're a conduit, and conduits don't hold on, they let go. Music, too, is preparation, but not background music, not ambience. The ney flute leads, breathy and broken, like a reed trying to remember the wind. The drum follows, mimicking the heartbeat, not metaphorically. It's tuned to an actual human pulse. The entire ceremony is synchronized with the pace of life and death, and ideally, somewhere in between. But here's the thing. For all the ceremony, all the robes and circles and sacred geometry, the spin itself still begins the way it always has, with longing. The dervish doesn't dance to entertain, doesn't spin to impress. He spins because standing still would be unbearable. The body becomes a compass only when it's been emptied of the urge to arrive anywhere in particular. And when it finally starts to spin, when the limbs surrender, and the head tilts, and the eyes blur, that's when prayer begins. There are prayers that use words, and then there are prayers that use velocity. In Sufism, the act of remembrance, zikr, usually involves rhythmic repetition of divine names, spoken, whispered, chanted, even breathed. But with the dervish, the mouth closes, and the body becomes the instrument. Every turn is a syllable. Every circle is a verse. And the body recites by moving, not speaking. It looks ecstatic from the outside, graceful, serene, maybe even theatrical, but internally, it's dismantling. The rotation breaks things apart slowly. Thoughts fray at the edges. The idea of you as something fixed begins to flicker. That's the point. The dervish isn't trying to achieve ecstasy. He's trying to forget he was ever separate from the divine in the first place. And the rhythm helps. There's a tempo to it, not imposed, but discovered. The spin begins gently, a soft pulse that grows until it dissolves the concept of beginning altogether. The boundaries blur, between steps and heartbeat, between balance and abandon. This isn't a trance born of excess. It's one born of repetition, the most ancient kind. In fact, if you listen closely, really listen, you'll notice that the music doesn't rise with the dancer. It holds steady. The ney weeps the same notes, over and over. The drum circles, unchanging. It's the dervish who changes, or more accurately, unravels, like a rope spinning out of its own knot. The prayer isn't in the music, it's in the tension between movement and stillness, between falling and never quite hitting the ground. And the hands, those famously poised hands, aren't symbols, they're instructions. One hand rises to the source, receiving the energy of being. The other pours it out into the dust. You are the passage between above and below, not a destination, not a holder, just a momentary vessel, an echo of the breath God used to animate clay. So the body prays, not in language, but in muscle memory, in the turn of the shoulder, the looseness of the knees, the tilt of the jaw toward surrender, and in the absence of thought, because thought is a wall, and this ritual has no room for architecture. Something opens. It opens, and then it drops. And what drops? If you're lucky, if you've practiced enough to let go, and endured enough to stop clinging, is your sense of self. Because the real zikr isn't about remembering God. It's about forgetting yourself long enough for God to remember you. And once that forgetting begins, it gets hard to stop. Which is exactly where the mind starts to lose track of what belongs to it, and what never did. At first, the world just sways a little. Nothing dramatic. The horizon tilts, your feet feel heavier, your breath sinks to the drum whether you want it to or not. But then the internal clock, the one that tells you where your limbs are, how long you've been standing, whether you're hungry or whole, that clock begins to glitch. The spin doesn't accelerate, you just stop noticing what's moving, including yourself. Neurologically, what's happening is disintegration, not in the catastrophic sense. In the elegant sense, sensory input gets overwritten. The brain's vestibular system, that little structure in your inner ear designed to scream at you when you're off balance, starts firing so consistently that the screaming becomes a whisper, and then it becomes nothing, like a car alarm that everyone stops hearing. That's when you usually walk around with the one who plans dinner and checks mirrors and remembers grudges begins to dissolve. Not because it's been broken, but because it's been spun so long it forgets which direction it's facing. And without direction, identity softens. In more clinical terms, this is known as altered proprioception. But in the language of mystics, it's called surrender. You stop locating yourself in your body and start drifting into a kind of embodied absence. Not sleep, not dissociation, something else entirely. Something too alert to be dreaming and too silent to be rational. It doesn't happen to everyone. That's part of the cruelty of it. Some spin for years and never touch the veil. Others fall through it by accident. But when it does happen, the descriptions tend to converge. Time collapses, thoughts evaporate, and what's left is a pulse, not your own, but one you can rest in. Some call it God. Others don't call it anything, because calling requires a voice, and the voice has long since gone quiet. This state, a sort of curated vertigo, is engineered, not with drugs, not with deprivation, with motion, rhythm, and repetition. And it's not unique to the Mevlevi. You'll find the same mechanism in Haitian Vodou ceremonies, in the stomping feet of Ethiopian pilgrims, in the rocking of Hasidic prayer. The body is the oldest tool for opening doors the mind was never supposed to fit through. But unlike the clean pixelated trances of meditation apps and yoga retreats, this trance leaves a mark. Not always physically though. Dizziness, nausea, and post-ritual collapse are common, but exactly, the self you return to isn't quite the same as the one you left. Something has been edited, a line removed, a center shifted, and in that shift, something strange takes root. You begin to suspect that the you who stepped into the spin was never particularly stable to begin with. Just scaffolding, just the temporary nameplate on a house that was always under renovation. Which is why, for the dervish, the most sacred moment isn't the trance itself, it's the collapse of the self inside it. That collapse has a name, it's called fana, and it's anything but metaphor. There's no fireworks, no booming voice, no final boss of consciousness waiting behind a golden curtain. The disappearance of the ego isn't theatrical, it's quiet, uncomfortably quiet. Sufi mystics call it fana, the annihilation of the self in the presence of the divine. It's not symbolic, it's experiential. It doesn't mean you forget your email password or suddenly become incapable of buying groceries. It means the scaffolding, the constant background hum of me, shuts off. Not dimmed, not quieted, gone. And what's left isn't a void, it's something worse, non-separation. Western psychology might call it ego death, but that phrase carries a kind of drama, like a Viking funeral of the personality. In fana, there's no corpse, no ashes, no obituary. The self doesn't explode, it leaks, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until you can't remember what it was like to need boundaries in the first place. This isn't something achieved after a particularly intense yoga class. It's cultivated through repetition, through exhaustion, through ritualized disappearance. You spin, and you lose track of the floor. You breathe, and it stops belonging to you. You think, and the thoughts arrive without authorship. Eventually, even the observer, the one saying "I'm experiencing this," slips away. And here's the unsettling part. You don't miss it. There's no panic, no scrambling to recover the eye, just a strange, hovering calm, like the moment after a candle goes out and before the room remembers to be dark. For the mystic, this is the goal. Not happiness, not bliss, erasure, the complete undoing of identity as a prerequisite for union with the real. But there's a risk. If you go in expecting transcendence, you might get horror instead, because losing your ego isn't always gentle. It's not built to be discarded. It clings, resists, negotiates, and when it realizes it's losing, it sometimes retaliates with fear, with nausea, with a sudden, sharp sense that you are not coming back the same. Sufi texts warn about this, obliquely. They speak of those who glimpsed the divine and never stopped trembling. Those who returned from the spiral, not with enlightenment, but with eyes that couldn't focus and a heart that beat to a rhythm no one else could hear. Because once you've tasted the absence of self, the presence of self feels strangely artificial, like a costume you forgot you were wearing. And yet, people return, again and again, to the mat, to the whirl, to the unmaking, because in fana something else flickers through the wreckage, not identity, not memory, something colder, brighter, more ancient than both, and it calls to you, which is why the spin never stops at personal transcendence, because the dervish doesn't just disappear, he becomes something else, the center of a world he no longer claims to own. And so he spins again, this time not around his self, but around everything else. The room doesn't move, but everything inside it begins to orbit. By the time fana has done its quiet work, what's left of the dervish is no longer a person. Not in the ordinary sense. He's not performing. He's not present. He's become a pivot, the axis around which something invisible, enormous, and vaguely divine begins to turn. And all he can do is spin. This isn't metaphor. Not to the believe. The dervish becomes the axis mundi, the sacred center of the universe. Just like Mount Meru in Hindu cosmology, or the black stone of the Kaaba, or the world tree in Norse myth. Something fixed, something vertical, something that holds the tension between heaven and earth, without trying to explain it. And unlike most religious symbols, this one wears a skirt and gets dizzy. The choreography is precise. The right foot steps in a tight half circle. The left heel remains planted. The arms rise, asymmetrical, one receiving, one giving. The eyes half-lidded, unblinking, fix on the left hand or some distant invisible thread. That detail matters. The gaze isn't outward, it's tethered to a point that doesn't move. Because if the gaze wanders, the center is lost. And without a center, the whole thing collapses into spectacle. From the outside it looks ornamental, elegant, hypnotic, symmetrical. But internally, it's structural. The dervish is not just maintaining balance, he's holding a position in the metaphysical architecture of being. His posture is the axis. His breath is the wind. His movement creates the sacred circumference. The spin is not the ritual, it's the cosmos in miniature. And if that sounds grandiose, remember this: the ancients didn't believe the world rotated around the sun. They believed it rotated around meaning, around sacrifice, around those rare humans who could momentarily stand in the center of things and not flinch. Of course, The irony is, the dervish doesn't feel central, quite the opposite. He feels like absence, like a hollow reed, like a doorway, and that's precisely why it works. You can't become the axis if you're full of yourself. The more hollowed out he becomes, the more stable the cosmos around him feels. It's almost geometric, this paradox. Only the emptied can endure the spin, so he turns, not as a man, not as a mystic, but as a living metaphor of gravity, of surrender, of the thin thread tying movement to stillness. And for a moment, a glorious, irreversible moment, it works. The ceiling fades, the floor forgets it has edges, and the watching world begins to revolve around the absence he's become. But not everyone is spinning. Some are watching, some are waiting, and some are witnessing something they're not sure they were meant to see, which leads us, quietly, to the ones who never move, but never look away. The room is silent, except for the creak of floorboards and the low breath of nay. The dervish turns, and turns, but the audience doesn't applaud, because they know, or at least suspect, they're not watching a person, they're watching a disappearance. And you don't clap for a vanishing act unless you want it to stop. In the traditional mevlivissima, the watchers are part of the ritual, not spectators, witnesses. There's a difference. Spectators expect entertainment, witnesses carry weight. They're responsible for what they see. They don't just observe the spinning. They hold it like an ember too holy to touch, too dangerous to drop. There's a kind of reverent discomfort in the air, a sacred awkwardness, because no one knows quite what to do with themselves, while a human being is slowly erasing their ego in front of them. You don't cheer, you don't speak, you just breathe carefully, like sound might rupture the membrane between this world and wherever the dervish has gone. And yet, their presence matters. The ritual needs them. It's not a private ecstasy. It's a public unraveling, like ancient mystery cults or Yoruba possession ceremonies, or even Catholic Mass. The transformation only stabilizes when there are eyes to reflect it. The audience doesn't complete the ritual, but they frame it. They hold the edges so the center can collapse safely. That said, not every gaze is created equal. In modern times, the ritual has drifted into hotel ballrooms and cruise ship decks, and with it, the watchers have changed. Cameras blink. Applause breaks like polite rain. The spinning continues, but something fragile flickers. Because when the dervish is treated like a performer, he must become conscious of being seen. And consciousness, as we've learned, is the enemy of trance. Still, even in these new settings, something slips through. A hush, a shiver, a child who falls silent mid-sentence. The ritual resists commodification, because the body, even in a tourist trap, remembers how to pray. The body remembers how to fall away. And yet, in traditional Sema, the watchers are not random. They are often initiates themselves, disciples, family, sometimes strangers, but never passive. They sit on the boundary between form and formlessness, witnessing not just a dancer but a map, one that outlines the route to divine presence, using nothing but circles and breath and cloth. And then there's the gendered silence, because not all eyes are welcome. Not all bodies are permitted to enter that sacred room. Some have to find other ways to spin. In the dim, incense-thick halls, where the Mevlevi ritual has lived for centuries, one presence has often been missing. Women, not completely absent, just pressed to the margins, watching from the balcony, listening through the lattice, spinning, perhaps, but never at the center, never as the axis. It wasn't always this cleanly divided. Early Sufi practice wasn't a closed circle. Women were part of the mystical current. They wrote ecstatic poetry. They led gatherings. Rabia al-Adwiya, in the 8th century, spoke of divine love with such terrifying clarity that male scholars later tried to categorize her as metaphor. But exclusion has a way of creeping in, disguised as structure, cloaked in the language of discipline. By the time the Mevlevi order formalized its ceremonies, spinning had become serious business, and serious business, in most of human history, tends to be curated by men. The Sema was codified, the choreography fixed, the garments sanctified, and the gender roles, well reinforced. The whirling dervish became a masculine silhouette, strong, silent, and disappearing into God on behalf of the rest of us. But women didn't stop spinning. They found other orders, other paths. Some danced in private gatherings. Some turned the kitchen floor into sacred ground. Some were mystics without robes, without recognition. They spun invisibly, and in doing so, preserved something raw the ritual had begun to lose. Urgency, not elegance, not performance, just the raw, frantic ache to dissolve. In the 20th century, the question started pressing: who gets to vanish? Who gets to take up space just long enough to become empty? And who is told that their disappearance is either excessive or inappropriate? Women began reclaiming the whirl, slowly, and not without resistance. Some were barred from official ceremonies, others were quietly tolerated but not formally trained. The paradox deepened in a ritual designed to dissolve identity. Gender remained strangely sticky, and yet, across Turkey, Iran, Europe, even the US, women dervishes began to emerge, spinning not for protest but for presence, not to imitate but to remember, because the whirl, once it enters the bones, doesn't ask for permission, it just demands space. Some of the newer ceremonies now include women openly, others still cling to tradition, citing purity of form as the rationale, as if God could be distracted by a skirt, as if the divine would be disturbed by hips that rotate slightly differently. But perhaps that's the most quietly radical thing about the whirl. Once the spinning starts, identity, gender included, starts to smear at the edges. No one is graceful forever. No one is seen clearly in motion. Everyone becomes blur, breath, cloth, surrender. And when the spinning finally stops, and the feet return to the floor, the question remains: what part of you comes back, and what part stayed behind, unraveling quietly, just out of reach? When the spinning stops, it doesn't really stop. The body might slow, the arms might fall, the fabric might settle, but something inside keeps moving, like a pendulum with nowhere else to go. The dervish's feet find stillness, but his insides are full of echoes, not voices, not visions, just motion, faint, insistent, irreversible. Re-entry is not a return, it's a negotiation. The self doesn't snap back into place like elastic. It oozes in slowly, hesitant and unsure, like a guest trying to remember which room was theirs. The dervish blinks, breathes, sometimes sways, sometimes sits, sometimes weeps, not from sadness, but from the shock of density, the sudden weight of being someone again, after spending eternity being nothing. Physiologically, the effects are mundane: dizziness, fatigue, tingling in the limbs. Some report nausea, others euphoria. But these symptoms don't explain the feeling of carrying something back with you that wasn't yours when you left. A memory, perhaps, but not of anything you've lived. More like a trace, a scent, the residue of touching something enormous and wordless. Traditional guides, the sheiks and senior dervishes, are trained to watch for this, not just for collapse, which can happen, but for confusion, for the quiet dissociation that follows a particularly deep trance. They'll help you sit, offer water, sometimes a hand on the back. No words, just weight, grounding, because language, in that moment, feels like trying to stitch the ocean with dental floss. In some rituals, the post-trance period is as sacred as the whirl itself. It's when the teachings settle, when the insights, if there were any, start to take shape, not as commandments or revelations, as questions, uncomfortable ones. What did I let go of? Why was I holding it? And what if the person I was before the spin wasn't the final version? This is why the Sema doesn't end with applause. It ends with stillness, with prayer, with long silences that make the room feel deeper than it did before. Because the act of whirling is not a climax, it's a doorway. And once crossed, the body doesn't walk the same. There's also the strange intimacy that lingers between dervish and dervish, between the whirler and the watchers, a kind of shared secret, something witnessed that can't be explained. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows. Something left the room, and something else came in. But the ritual doesn't last forever. Eventually, shoes are retrieved, robes are folded, the drum is muted, and the dervish walks out into a world that didn't change, only he did. And now he must carry that change into marketplaces, into traffic, into dinner with relatives who still think the soul is something you visit on weekends. But just sometimes, the world listens, and begins to turn round him, and, until the whirl is reduced to art, to spectacle, to the souvenir version of surrender, which brings us, inevitably, to the final spin. When sacred motion meets global tourism, they dim the lights. Cue the neigh. A man in white enters the stage, arms poised, eyes distant. He begins to spin, slowly, gracefully, predictably. The The crowd leans forward. Phones rise. A child whispers something about ballerinas, and the man spins on. But this isn't a SEMA. It's a Tuesday evening cultural showcase at a hotel in Istanbul. And the dervish's trance is scheduled to end in precisely 12 minutes, just in time for the buffet. This is how it happens. This is how sacred motion slips its context and finds itself pressed against velvet curtains and LED lighting. The world survives, but not untouched. It's curated now, streamlined, sanded smooth for export. The shroud becomes a costume. The collapse of ego becomes choreography. And that wild, tear-drenched, wordless longing gets edited out somewhere between the gift shop and the exit sign. The shift began long before Instagram. As early as the 20th century, the Mevlev order, banned by Ataturk during Turkey's secular reforms, found itself suspended between extinction and adaptation. When the bans eased, the order resurfaced in a changed world, one where rituals had to prove their cultural value to survive. And so the world became heritage. The trance became theatre. Now, certified dervish performances happen in state theatres, tourist packages, gala events. Some are reverent. Others feel like a reenactment of a prayer someone else once meant. It's not always hollow. Many performers are genuine initiates, still seeking fana behind their half-closed eyes, but the tension is undeniable. When you're being watched by 300 tourists holding mojitos, ego death becomes a little more complicated. And yet, the spin persists, because something in it refuses to be fully commodified. The motion still moves. Even drained of context, even stripped of silence, the world still holds a pulse older than the stage it's trapped on. Sometimes, even the audience feels it, a flicker, a stillness, a sudden tightness in the chest that doesn't belong to spectacle. And just for a moment, the room forgets what it came for. In a way, this tension mirrors the mystic's own, to dissolve within a world that constantly insists on identity. The modern dervish, performing for clicks or coin, walks the same line his ancestors did, between form and formlessness, between outer ritual and inner fire. The world watches, the dervish spins, and if he's lucky, if the breath holds, if the rhythm takes, he might just vanish again, briefly, between the shutter clicks and the polite applause. And when he returns, sweat-soaked half there, blinking in the glare of stage lights, the world remains behind him, turning, always turning, in silence, in memory, in the center of a world that only pretends to be still. They walked in sandals, mostly barefoot, if they had something to prove. The road from Athens to Eleusis was only 20 kilometers, but it stretched longer in the mind, a crooked spine of sacred land that pulsed once a year under the weight of thousands. No one spoke openly about why they were going. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew. The Eleusinian Mysteries weren't advertised. There were no flyers, no priests with megaphones. And yet, the crowds came. Philosophers, peasants, senators, slaves, even women, even foreigners, as long as they weren't murderers and could speak a bit of Greek. Democracy had its limits, but mystery, that was strangely inclusive. They gathered first in Athens, the Eleusinian, at the foot of the Acropolis. Here, the sacred objects were kept, carried in by priests who didn't explain and didn't need to. A fire was lit, vows were taken. Then, the procession began. It wasn't solemn, it was theatrical. They laughed, sang, shouted obscenities. Women mocked men, and men pretended not to flinch. One of the goddesses involved, Yomba, was crude and loud and holy. Humor, it turned out, was a necessary opening act for transcendence. You had to empty yourself of dignity before you could be filled with the sacred. The road twisted along the coast, past the sacred bridge, where children yelled blessings from the roadside, and dancers in rags performed half-remembered rituals. Everything was layered in paradox, a festival of silence and noise, of secrecy and spectacle. It wasn't a pilgrimage of piety. It was a rehearsed unmooring, a slow peeling back of who you thought you were, performed in broad daylight with strangers. And still, no one said what would happen at the end. Because no one could, not even if they wanted to. Initiates were bound by a vow so severe that breaking it could get you executed. Literally, the philosopher Diagras was exiled for mocking the mysteries. A playwright was tried for putting too much of it on stage. Even centuries later, when Cicero was initiated, he described it as the most meaningful experience of his life, and then said absolutely nothing else. This wasn't just about secrecy, it was about containment. The experience had to remain whole, unspeakable, unshared, undigested, or it would lose its sting. Talking about it would be like whispering the punchline of a god's joke. And the gods, famously, don't like being explained. So they walked, in heat, in hunger, in expectation, toward a sanctuary built on a myth of disappearance, and grief, and descent into the dark, because the story wasn't told to entertain, it was told to prepare. And the one who prepared them best, the one who shaped the whole thing into motion, was a goddess who stopped the world until someone gave her daughter back. She was gathering flowers. That's how it always starts. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, eyes full of spring, reaches for a narcissus bloom, one that shouldn't be there, shouldn't be that beautiful, shouldn't smell like something with an agenda. The earth splits, a chariot rises, Hades snatches her in a gesture that's been misnamed love ever since, and the world forgets how to grow. This wasn't a cautionary tale, not in Eleusis, it was a blueprint. The myth wasn't performed at the mysteries, it was embodied, reenacted, not in costumes, but in the sequence of silence, fear, descent, and rebirth that defined the entire ritual structure. It wasn't for children, it wasn't for pleasure. It was a cosmology made tactile, a script to be walked, swallowed, maybe even survived. Demeter, the mother, searches for 9 days. She wanders, refuses ambrosia, refuses sleep, refuses Olympus itself. The gods plead. She spits. The world starves. Wheat rots. Mothers weep. Nothing flowers. It's the original divine tantrum, and it works. Eventually, a deal is struck. Persephone returns, but only for part of the year. For the other part, she stays in the underworld, queen of something no one wants to name. This is not a tidy myth. There's no villain, no moral, just a rhythm of loss and return, of darkness and bloom, that the initiates were expected to feel in their bones, and they did. Everything in the Eleusinian Mysteries mirrored this cycle. The fasting echoed Demeter's refusal to eat, the processions recalled her wanderings, the descent into the Telesterion, that massive stone hall where the final revelation occurred, was Persephone's plunge into the unknown, and the return, if it happened, was resurrection in everything but name. The genius of it wasn't that people believed it, it's that belief didn't matter. You didn't have to believe Demeter existed, you just had to feel what it meant to be broken by grief, to descend without a map, to crawl back up into the sunlight altered beyond articulation. This is how myth functioned in Eleusis, not as a bedtime story, but as a set of coded instructions, a manual for metaphysical dismemberment. You don't read it, you don't recite it, you live it, preferably on an empty stomach, surrounded by strangers, holding a torch that doesn't quite keep the dark away. But before the descent could happen, before the mind was bent, and the world opened sideways, something had to shift inside the body first. And that shift began with laughter. The sacred kind. The kind that bubbles up after grief, when you realize the gods aren't ignoring you, they're playing with you. It begins in the gut. Before you glimpse anything divine, before the veils drop or the torches flicker, you stop eating. For days, not completely, not cruelly. Just enough to make your hands tremble slightly when you reach for the cup. Enough to blur the edge between hunger and anticipation. Enough to make your body light, like it's waiting to fall. The fasting is ritual, yes, but it's also functional. It softens the mind, makes the skin thinner, the boundaries looser. Add to that the long walking, the strange songs, the sacred mud on your skin, and suddenly the line between preparation and initiation isn't so clear anymore. And just when the tension peaks, when silence becomes unbearable, when the gods feel too far away or too close to bear, someone tells a joke. This part is real. It's not metaphor. In the Eleusinian cycle, there's a moment when Demeter, wild with grief and rage, sits on a stone in Eleusis and refuses to speak. Nothing can move her, until a servant, Yomba, lifts her skirts and says something so obscene it rips a laugh out of the goddess's mouth. No one knows the exact line, which is a pity. It's probably the filthiest sacred utterance in recorded history, but it wasn't vulgarity for shock's sake. It was leverage, a crack in the grief, a rupture in the solemnity that let something ancient, something joy-shaped, slip in. In the mysteries, this moment was mirrored. Scholars disagree on whether it happened at the start of the rite or somewhere along the darkened corridors, but everyone agrees laughter was required, not polite chuckles, the gut-punch kind. The kind that comes when you suddenly realize that all your seriousness, all your fasting and prayers and existential dread is just the universe trying not to laugh at you. Humor, in Eleusis, was medicine, not the kind that soothes, but the kind that shocks the system. It cracked open the psyche just enough to let the ritual slip inside. Without it, the descent into the mysteries might have been just a performance. With it, it became something messier, riskier, real, and the darkness waited. Because after the laughter came the march, torches were lit, faces vanished, words dropped away, and the initiates were led, not told, not invited, led into a hall with no windows, no altar, and no clear promise of return. But not yet. Not quite. First, there was a cup to drink, a thick, bitter brew that looked like barley soup and didn't smell entirely innocent. It was called Kichion, a rustic name, almost cheerful. The kind of word you'd expect to find in a farmer's breakfast, not at the edge of divine revelation. Barley, mint, water, basic, pastoral, almost laughably harmless. But the Eleusinian brew wasn't meant to nourish, it was meant to loosen, and something in it did. The cup was passed near the end of the ritual. After the walk, after the fast, after the jokes had cracked your dignity open like a pomegranate, the initiates gathered in the shadows of the telesterion, and each one drank. They were told what it was. They knew the ingredients. They believed they were ready. But what came next didn't feel like barley and mint. There's a theory, whispered more loudly with each passing decade, that Kichion was laced with something stronger. Not poison, not magic, a fungus. Specifically, Claviceps purpurea, better known as ergot, a parasite that grows on grain, especially in damp conditions. It contains alkaloids, chemically similar to LSD, hallucinogenic, potent, capable of turning a harvest into a vision, a field into a door. Of course, it's just a theory. There's no surviving recipe. The temple was burned, the priests were scattered, and the oath of silence, even centuries later, held. But the circumstantial evidence is thick. Reports of profound visions, timelessness, ego dissolution, the feeling of death followed by something blindingly bright. The kind of experience you don't forget, and definitely don't fabricate. Plato went through it. So did Sophocles. So did Marcus Aurelius. These were not men prone to emotional exaggeration, and yet they spoke of the mysteries as if they had died and been remade, seen something that made all other truths look like shadows. But they never described it directly. Only metaphor, only hints, a blessed sight and vision. Those who have seen it fear death no more. The brew was never mass-produced. It was sacred, administered by priests called pharmakoi. Yes, the word that gives us both pharmacy and poisoner. They knew exactly how much to use, how to brew it, when to serve it. Too little, and nothing happens. Too much, and your divine revelation turns into cardiac arrest. But dosage wasn't the only variable. Context mattered. Fasting mattered. The myth, the darkness, the laughter, they weren't fluff. They were priming the psyche, peeling back its resistances so the Kichion wouldn't just hit the bloodstream, it would hit the soul. And then, of course, the walls would shift, the room would breathe, and the initiate would begin to descend. Not metaphorically, not dramatically, just enough to notice that what looked like a temple was actually something else entirely. A wound, a womb, a gate, and somewhere beneath the stone, beneath the barley, beneath the polite silence of centuries, Persephone was waiting. It wasn't a temple in the usual sense. No towering columns, no open-air altar. The telesterion was squat, square, windowless, a stone box the size of a small stadium, built not to impress from the outside, but to contain something impossible inside. It could hold 10,000, by some estimates, and yet no one ever described what happened there. Not in detail, not once. The most sacred space in ancient Greece, and it's nearly absent from the historical record. We know what it looked like, where the doors were, where the sacred objects were stored, the hieria, still undefined, still shrouded in polite academic guesswork. But what people saw in there, silence, not ignorance, just an oath so tightly bound it survived empires. And the thing is, people wanted to talk. The Athenian playwright Aeschylus was nearly executed for including a single line in a tragedy that might have referenced the rites. It doesn't matter what the line was. What matters is that it implied the veil could be lifted. It couldn't. Inside the telesterion, the initiates sat in rows. The room was lit only by torches, or not at all. The sacred drink had been consumed. The myth had been embedded. The identity had been cracked. And then, something happened. Ancient sources call it epopteia, the seeing, not a vision. The vision, the one that justified the fast, the walk, the secrecy, the madness, the one that convinced skeptics, silenced cynics, made philosophers weep and slaves sing, a vision that rendered language temporarily useless. Some say it was a theatrical performance, a priest emerging with a sheaf of grain, lit by sudden flame. Others say it was the lifting of a curtain, the sudden revelation of an object too sacred to name. Still others believe it was a group hallucination, guided by myth and molecule, in which the entire room dissolved into divine presence. Whatever it was, it worked. Initiates emerged shaken, calm, different. They described the feeling of having touched death, not metaphorically, not as a symbol but as an event, something they endured, survived, transcended. They said it changed how they lived, but more than anything, it changed how they died. The telesterion wasn't a place of worship, it was a furnace, a crucible for the self. You went in full of questions and left unable to ask them, not because you found answers, but because you no longer needed them. And that exquisite, trembling, post-revelation silence was the real sacred object. But silence doesn't mean stillness, because what happened inside the telesterion didn't stay there. It followed the initiates back into the world, in their breath, in their eyes, in the eerie calm with which they now stared down the one thing no Greek had ever escaped, death. They called it a second birth, a phrase thrown around too easily now, but back then, it meant something far stranger. To be reborn in Eleusis was not to return glowing and inspired like a spa retreat. It was to have died without a tombstone, quietly, while the world watched. The Greeks feared death, not in the theatrical way, no pitchforks, no lakes of fire, but in that dull, Greek way, asimosness, disintegration, a cold slide into shadow. Hades wasn't torture, it was bureaucracy, endless grey, no memory, no motion, no you. The mysteries offered an alternative, not an afterlife, exactly, but a rehearsal, a chance to stare into the blank face of oblivion and remain standing. The myth of Persephone wasn't just background, it was prophecy. She had died, had descended, had come back altered, and now so would you. The experience inside the telesterion was engineered with fasting, darkness, laughter, hallucination, and dread to mimic the unraveling of identity. Not symbolically, viscerally. You watched your name come apart, your certainty peel off like skin. The person you walked in as, gone, left on the stone floor like an old robe. But instead of terror, there was relief. Ego death, it turns out, feels oddly clean, like exhaling something you didn't realize you'd been holding. A slow, dissolving release into not being. And then, impossibly, something bloomed in its place. Not the self, not a new personality, something else. Something bright, unnameable, so still it felt like standing in sunlight without casting a shadow. That was the gift. Not knowledge, not power, perspective. To know, in your bones, that death is not the worst thing. That loss is seasonal. That darkness is a hallway, not a tomb. And when the initiates returned, blinking into torchlight, they didn't return to normal. They returned carrying a calmness, a quiet, a smirk, maybe, at the way other people clung so hard to their little stories. Initiation didn't make them better. It made them looser, like they'd been untied from something they once thought was essential. This is what made the mysteries dangerous. Not what they revealed, but what they unmoored. They made death look soft, which meant authority, divine or human, had a little less grip. And people noticed. Philosophers began to circle Eleusis like moths. Poets hinted, politicians whispered. Everyone wanted to know what changed the initiates, what softened them, centered them, stripped them clean. But no one could say they just glowed a little differently. You could spot them, not always, but often enough to make the rumors stick. The ones who'd gone through it, the ones who'd stepped into the dark and come back, had a look. Not exalted, not enlightened, just unbothered. Aristotle never went, which might explain a few things. Plato did, and never shut up about it, except of course, when it came to the part that mattered. He said the mysteries taught him the difference between seeing and understanding. That real wisdom wasn't knowing facts, it was remembering something the soul already knew. A quiet kind of knowing, like recognizing your own name after a long silence. The Roman statesman Cicero was initiated later, when the mysteries had already calcified a little. But even he, trained in rhetoric, called it the most important experience of his life. This, from a man who saw civil war, conspiracies, and decapitation up close. And still, he glowed a little when Eleusis came up. What did they bring back? Not visions, those faded, not knowledge, that had always been overrated. What they brought back was peace, a bone-deep, oddly practical peace that made ordinary life seem lighter. A peasant might carry it in his laughter, a philosopher in the way he paused before answering, a general in the way he stopped fearing the knife, and that terrified some people. Because if death isn't terrifying, then control gets slippery. You can't threaten someone who's already walked through the end of themselves. You can't bribe them with heaven, or bully them with hell. They've seen the bottom of things, and smiled. So the mysteries became fashionable, yes, but also quietly radical. They whispered, without ever saying it, that the gods didn't need temples, that the soul didn't need rescuing, and that most of what passed for religion was just very elaborate stage fright. And the best part, no one could explain it. You could live beside and initiate your whole life and never know what they'd seen. You might guess, of course, piece together clues from their silences, their stray metaphors, their sudden love of torchlight, but the experience was sealed, personal, non-transferable, like trying to describe music to someone who's never heard anything but wind. The only way to know was to go, and so the mysteries persisted. For centuries, while kingdoms rose and fell, while gods changed names and coins changed hands, Eleusis remained, and it remained, in part, because it knew how to keep its mouth shut. No one was joking when they said it was forbidden to talk. The penalty for revealing the Eleusinian mysteries wasn't a fine, or a slap on the wrist, or a stern talking to from a priest in robes. It was death, quick, unapologetic, and absolute. Not because the secrets were dangerous in the modern sense, no state codes, no classified intel, but because the silence was the structure. Pull one thread, and the entire experience unraveled. And make no mistake, the silence wasn't just mystical, it was political. This was ancient Greece, after all, a place where religion and governance cohabitated in public bathhouses. The mysteries, for all their talk of grain and goddesses, were also an institution, a stabilizing force, a rite that gathered citizens, foreigners, women, even slaves under one roof, and asked them to confront their own mortality in sync. That kind of thing unifies people, which also means it can be used. The Eleusinian priesthood wasn't exactly grassroots. The high-ranking roles, hierophant, dodechos, passed through elite families like family heirlooms. The Keraks and the Eumolpidae held the keys to the ritual, generation after generation. They knew the timing, the symbols, the gestures, and, perhaps most importantly, they knew how to say nothing. Silence, in Eleusis, wasn't passive, it was cultivated. The vow wasn't just a spiritual courtesy, it was a boundary, a line between the initiate and the uninitiated, between the sacred and the profane. Cross it, and the gods weren't the only ones watching. One man did. Athenian orator Andokitis, accused of revealing parts of the mysteries during a drunken symposium. Whether he did or didn't barely mattered. The scandal shook Athens. It triggered political purges, paranoia, and a reminder that even the whisper of blasphemy could shift the ground under a city's feet. Because secrecy isn't just about keeping others out, it's about keeping meaning in. The less that's said, the more the experience swells. Silence becomes a container, and the ritual becomes untouchable, because there's no way to quote it, debate it, or parody it. You can't desecrate what you can't describe. And yet, for all its tight-lipped discipline, the mystery spread, slowly, strategically. Rome took notice. Emperors were initiated. The rites adapted, absorbed, bled into other cults. But the core stayed sealed. Even in translation, even in imitation, the original center remained wrapped in ritual silence. And in that silence, paradoxically, the mysteries became louder, more alluring. A secret you couldn't know but could still walk toward. A divine promise with no pamphlet. Eventually, of course, that silence would clash with a religion that preferred declarations, creeds, dogma. A God who spoke, not cryptically, but clearly, and once, for all. But not yet. First, the seed had to germinate, because the idea of dying and coming back, of descending and rising, that structure didn't vanish when the telesterion emptied, it just changed temples. The mysteries were never supposed to be inherited, and yet, fragments of them keep showing up in places that pretend not to remember. There's no smoking scroll, of course. No direct handoff from Demeter to Christ. But the pattern held. Descent, silence, suffering, revelation, a God who dies and comes back, not to gloat, but to guide. The world has always recycled its symbols, and the Eleusinian script was simply too elegant to discard. The early Christians lived in the shadow of Eleusis. Literally, Paul preached in Athens. Clement of Alexandria couldn't stop writing about mysteries and initiations, even as he tried to rename them. The Church Fathers were suspiciously fluent in the structure of sacred drama. Baptism was a kind of ritual death. Communion, a sacred meal with veiled meanings. Easter, an underground emergence. Persephone's fingerprints were all over the resurrection story, hidden, smudged, rebranded, but there. And it wasn't just Christianity. Gnostic sects borrowed heavily with their secret knowledge, their layers of initiation, their belief that the world was a kind of prison only certain truths could unlock. The Orphic cults, the Mithraic rites, even certain alchemical texts in medieval Europe, all echo the choreography of Eleusis. Enter the dark, drink, die, see, return. What made the Eleusinian model so durable wasn't the dogma, it was the structure. It answered something primal without explaining it. You didn't need theology. You needed a myth that moved through the body, a story you could walk into, a death that didn't kill you, just rearranged you. By the time Christianity rose to dominance, the mysteries had already been folded into the spiritual subconscious of the Mediterranean. Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE. The mysteries were still running, still secret, still silent. But in 392, under Theodosius I, pagan rites were banned. The telesterion was shuttered, the hiera hidden or destroyed. The silence that once protected the rite became the silence of disappearance. But even disappearance has a half-life. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, artists began to paint Persephone again. Alchemists whispered about sacred marriages and inner descents. Psychedelic philosophers in the 20th century started asking if Kichion was the missing key to Western spirituality. Timothy Leary called Eleusis the origin of the first trip. Carl Jung saw Demeter as the archetype of the devouring mother and the mourning goddess in one breath. And then there's the modern pilgrim, not to Eleusis, but to ayahuasca circles, to Burning Man domes, to the cold flickering light of a flotation tank in downtown Berlin, chasing the same thing, ego death, followed by narrative rebirth. The structure still whispers. You just have to know how to listen. But Eleusis itself, the stones are still there, cracked, bleached, quiet, which leads us, not to an ending, but to an afterimage. The strange fate of things that are too sacred to forget, but too dangerous to keep. The fire didn't ask for permission. In the year 396 CE, Alaric the Visigoth sacked Greece. His troops, mostly Christianized by that point, did what conquerors do. They burned. The telesterion, the sacred hall that had swallowed generations of initiates, went up in smoke. The altars cracked. The priests fled, or converted, or simply vanished. And just like that, the longest-running mystery cult in history disappeared from the surface of the world, but not from the bones. It's tempting to mark that as the end. Paganism crumbling under the boot of monotheism, torches extinguished by doctrine. But the mysteries never operated on the surface. Their real architecture was internal, mythic, bodily, mnemonic. And that kind of structure doesn't burn, it just burrows. The site at Eleusis became a Christian church, then a ruin, then a curiosity. In the 19th century, archaeologists began to dig, brushing dust off steps that once led to nowhere. They found votive offerings, torches, remnants of a temple to Demeter and Persephone, but no Hera, no final revelation. The silence held. Meanwhile, outside the rubble, the structure kept mutating. Carl Karenyi called the mysteries the spiritual transformation of terror. Aldous Huxley linked them to the psychedelic experience. Gordon Wasson, in his quiet obsession, tried to reverse-engineer the Kaikian, chasing it through chemistry and archaeology, like a man trying to bottle a dream. Harvard even launched a decades-long investigation into the possibility that the Eleusinian rites were chemically induced, a study involving classicists, pharmacologists, and one ex-Jesuit priest who'd seen something during a mushroom trip he couldn't quite explain. And then came the revivalists, the psychonauts, the seekers, people who had never fasted on the Athenian road or watched grain shimmer under torchlight, but who recognized the pattern in their own strange initiations. They called it ego death, called it rebirth, sometimes they even called it Persephone. Today, the site of Eleusis is a museum. Tourists walk across the cracked marble. They read plaques that say initiation hall without elaboration. The air smells of stone and sea. There's nothing to see, and yet, for those who know the rhythm, the place hums, because some things don't die. Not when they're woven into the way humans process fear. Not when they mirror the internal seasons, the descent, the unmaking, the return. And certainly not when they offer a death that comes without a coffin. The mysteries are over. No priest will guide the way. No goddess will descend on cue. And still, people keep walking, not toward a temple anymore, but toward the dark, still hungry for silence, still thirsty for whatever was in that cup, still aching for the sacred joke that breaks the grief, still searching for a room with no windows, where something dies, and something brighter walks out in its place. And that's the real secret. It never needed to be spoken. It only needed to be remembered.